Welcome back to my friend the Rainbow Circle. Um, I'm sitting at a different angle to get those J.J. Abrams sun flares. Just, for no reason. I just like them. But I wanted to talk about a movie called Sunchoke, actually, because this is fairly relevant. But I'm running out of time. I've imposed these restrictions on the number of movies to choose, and I'm down to 3 left. Sunchoke is a great movie, but I also thought about the Rob Zombie movies, which I love so much, and there's one that gets forgotten all the time, Lords of Salem. But it's an interesting direct comparison to look at just the story structure of Sunchoke and the story structure of Lords of Salem. And so that is my cheaty way of giving an honorable mention to all the other Rob Zombie movies. Rob Zombie movies are great just because, love letters to 70s movies. And I think if you looked at Devil's Rejects, which is, his masterpiece, of course, so far, it's, you could do a whole study of how does he manage to present the Firefly family as these awful, irredeemable, horrible people, but how does he get you to still like them and root for them? And there's the whole ending sequence of that one, to the tune of Freebird. He said he wanted to redefine Freebird so that every time you heard it, you would think of that scene, which I do for sure. I don't hear Freebird that often, but it certainly redefines Freebird. But it's a beautiful movie, and especially if you compare that to House of a Thousand Corpses. And I love House of a Thousand Corpses. That was much more over the top and satirical and wacky, and that was really just a series of horror vignettes, basically. Just a series of horror moments and crazy monsters. Just a lovely, lovely movie. Devil's Rejects was much more of a serious, intense drama with an actual story. House of a Thousand Corpses kind of has a story, but it's just, it's an homage. Both of those movies are really just homages to, a lot of the similar movies like that from the past, from the 70s. I don't know that I have much more to say about them. Going really in depth about Devil's Rejects, how he creates sympathy for horrible people, is really fascinating. And it might just be something simple, like just the William Forsythe character is much worse than them. And House of a Thousand Corpses, the teens, like Chris Hardwick and Rainn Wilson, they're more awful than the Firefly family on just a social level. Is that the key? I don't know. It's a fascinating question. What's really appealing about just horrible, horrible murderers in movies? My dogs are going to start barking. Of course. There's a lot of noises out here this afternoon. Anyway, sirens and birds. Maggie's protecting us from squirrels. Thank you for protecting us from the squirrel. Okay. So, there's a lot to say about those. But I think Lords of Salem, the way it ends, somewhat similar to Sunchoke. Sunchoke is, a very, very little movie, and that's definitely, I've never seen that on a list. I've seen some of the Rob Zombie movies on lists every once in a while. Like every once in a while, Devil's Rejects will make a list because it's an excellent movie. There's birds of prey flying all over with the birds of prey shadows. But Lords of Salem never makes a list. That's sort of like the lowest on the list usually. So it sort of just gets overshadowed by the Firefly family movies. But I think it's a beautiful movie, and I think it's an interesting one if you looked at it side by side with Hereditary, especially. When I saw Hereditary, which I've talked about in previous videos, and clearly it's an excellent movie. It makes lists all the times, so it doesn't quite fit the criteria that I've set for this list. So, but you know, it's a beautiful movie as well. But if you put Hereditary and Lords of Salem side by side, it makes for an interesting juxtaposition. So, spoiler alert on both of those. But they're kind of the same story, but inverted in an inverted way. But what makes Hereditary really intense is sort of that schematic uncertainty. You're not quite sure what kind of story it is. Is it a ghost story? Is it just a story of somebody going crazy? I mean, Sunchoke, you know, the ending is sort of the, you know, this visionary ending, but it's clearly just a story of somebody turning into a murderer. So there's schematic certainty. Lords of Salem is pretty overtly a story of a witch coven right up front. So they have schematic certainty, so you know what kind of story it is. Part of what enhances the excitement of Hereditary is it's the twisting and turning. It makes it uncertain what kind of story it is. It turns out it's a witch coven story. But yeah, definitely most of Rob Zombie movies, there's a definite schematic certainty about what kind of story it is, for sure. It's very much an overt homage to the great movies of the 70s. The Lords of Salem, it's pretty obviously a witch coven movie. It doesn't really, it's not really subtle about that. It's not really even trying to be subtle about that, but it's this witch coven wants Sherry Moon Zombie to have some kind of Satan baby. Pretty typical of that kind of story. And Hereditary is kind of a version of that too. And you got tons of stories. I mean, you got tons of movies like that, like Rosemary's Baby, that kind of thing. So it's kind of a riff on Rosemary's Baby or that kind of story. But then I think the beautiful thing that really makes Lords of Salem stand out as a movie is it degenerates in its story structure, which I think is a very positive thing. You might not think that sounds like a positive thing, but it degenerates. It unspools, I guess is probably a way to put it. It unspools and becomes a series of just really beautiful just images, and it's like image after image after image. It basically turns into a music video. This is why Lords of Salem makes for an interesting one for this list, because it gives me an opportunity to talk about music video narrative structure. If you really look at, and Rob Zombie, comes from music world and directed music videos and commercials and things like that before he directed movies. But if you look at the history of the music video, it really rose in the 80s. It's this new thing. There have been music videos before that, of course, but rose in the 80s is this new thing and lasted about 20 years. And then, there are plenty of music videos, but they kind of have a different, but they kind of have a different function. You don't have TV shows devoted to them. They're more flourishing on the medium of YouTube. Short attention span, brief sort of visceral stimulation for a moment. And the thing about schema, some of them are designed for short-term stimulation, like a song. Just generally, a song that is structurally designed just to last just for a few minutes, and it works perfectly fine that way. And a music video is designed to last for just a few minutes. So one of the things MTV and other music video companies recognized is the short attention span that their viewers had. So they would watch a video and then they would turn away. So they started creating these schema around the music videos to keep people watching for like a full half hour. So basically, TV channels were not designed to contain music videos for any sustainable amount of time. You know, in the early days, the novelty of them, I think, sustained a lot of interest. But music video by music video, once the novelty really wore off, it was much harder to sustain, a full attention for a full half hour. And it really took YouTube before, as a medium, it really worked within the bounds of YouTube, where you could just watch it and, move on. But that's just the nature. I mean, you look at a lot of music videos, they don't really have an element that, most of them, don't really have an element that forces you to stay to the end to resolve, something that's unresolved. It's usually just a brief moment of unresolved feelings, like a Rob Zombie song, just anger, and then more anger. It's never really resolved. It just ends. And so music videos will be, a collage of just stimulating images. And it's a place that surrealism really flourished, but it's not a place that narrative really flourished. And so you have a lot of people, you'll hear this every once in a while, that'll say Rob Zombie is just a music video director and his movies are really just music videos. I don't know that that's a criticism. It's just a different medium, and it works really, really well in movies like Lords of Salem, where the unspooling of the narrative thread follows the unspooling of Sherry Moon Zombie's character's mentality. And so, I mean, in the narrative itself, it's suspenseful, but because it's so schematically familiar, it's Rosemary's Baby, basically. You have part of what sustains the first half of it is just the nostalgia part of it. And that's what Rob Zombie's good at, framing these really nostalgically structured movies, and the stimulation comes from the familiarity of something like Devil's Rejects. Part of what sustains the stimulation is that it's familiar, but there's so much new and there's so much attachment you have to the characters that it's not just sustained on nostalgia. Lords of Salem, it starts off with that sort of nostalgic vibe of, that kind of movie, the witch coven type of movie. Suspiria, I mentioned Suspiria before, but that's not like about Satan's baby, but so it just unspools into the series of images, and I think at that point you set up a suspenseful story. It's a familiar suspenseful story, and then it unspools into just this collage of really intensely visceral images, and it sort of just ends that way, without any sort of explanation. And you can get what happens. I mean, you can just figure it out. Whereas the impressive thing about Hereditary is quite different in that it ends up being the familiar sort of demon baby type of story. But the way it unfolds is so suspenseful because it sets up all these uncertainties. You're not quite sure that it's a Rosemary's Baby type of story. And all the different parts just fit together just so perfectly. So it's a perfectly structured movie. Lords of Salem doesn't have much structure and just sort of unravels. But I think it works really well. It's just underappreciated. It's definitely not, the exact same sort of movie that Rob Zombie always makes. It's, intensely viscerally stimulating, and, image intensity of images really sustain the visceral stimulation. But story-wise, it's quite a different story structure than what he usually does. So anyway, Lords of Salem, definitely check it out. It's well worth watching, and the whole oeuvre of Rob Zombie movies. And Sunchoke. Sunchoke is a much smaller, much more intimate story of somebody going crazy and killing people. But she has this sort of backstory about remembering her birth, and so it sort of ends with this really intense imagery of remembering her birth, which is What does that mean? I don't know, but it's just, it's one of those things that horror movies are good at, just leaving you with an image that really haunts you. So I guess I have 2 more. I don't know how I'm gonna just do 2 more. I might cheat again and reference 1,000 other things. I meant to mention Creep and Creep 2 when I was talking about Honeymoon, because Creep and Creep 2 are hilarious, super underrated movies, and I totally forgot to mention them. I'm gonna kind of, for the next 2, I'll probably cheat and just mention 17 different movies per list, just to get them all in. But anyway, I'll see you on the next episode.